The sun was a hammer over the San Saba Basin, beating the dust into a fine, shimmering powder that clung to everything. For the man who lived in the heart of that desolation, it was just another Tuesday. He was a creature of habit, carved from the same hard rock and unforgiving sun as the landscape itself. His face was a road map of places he'd never speak of, his eyes the color of a washed-out winter sky. He rode a rangy mule named Cain, an animal as ill-tempered and resilient as its owner. They were returning from the dry creek bed where a trickle of water still stubbornly seeped from the cracked earth, the two water barrels on Cain's back sloshing a rhythm that counted the slow, hot miles back to the one-room cabin that was the center of his world. He didn't have a name, not one he used anyway. He had left it behind with the uniform and the cannon smoke and the ghosts of men who had called him brother. Here, he was simply the man who survived. The routine was his armor. Wake before dawn, check the snares, tend the mule, fetch the water, and mend what was broken. But that day the rhythm broke. High on the ridge overlooking the trail, he paused, his hand resting on the worn stock of the Winchester in his saddle scabbard. Below, where the trail snaked through a narrow pass of sun-bleached rock, something was wrong. A wagon lay on its side like a great wounded beast, its canvas top ripped and flapping in the hot breeze. A dead horse lay in the traces, its legs stiff in the air. Buzzards were already circling, patient and black against the searing blue sky. Trouble was a disease on the frontier, and he had long ago decided he was immune. He preferred to let it pass by. But something held him there. It was the stillness. An attack was loud and violent, but the aftermath had a silence all its own, a quiet that screamed of what had been lost. He nudged Cain with his heel, the mule grunting in protest as they began the slow descent from the ridge. He was breaking his own first rule, mind your own business. He did not yet know that this decision, this simple turn towards someone else's ruin, would unravel the solitary life he had so carefully built. The worst of it, he figured, was already over. He was wrong. The closer he got, the worse the scene became. The wagon had belonged to a family, judging by the scattered contents. A child's wooden toy, a shattered porcelain doll, and a heavy family Bible lay half buried in the dust, its pages fluttering like a wounded bird. Two men lay dead near the wreckage, likely drivers or guards, their bodies already swelling in the oppressive heat. They had been shot and left where they fell. The outlaws had been thorough, taking the remaining horses and anything of value. He walked the perimeter, his eyes missing nothing, his hand never straying far from the Colt at his hip. He was a hunter, and this was a language he understood. He could read the story in the tracks. At least 6 riders, shod horses coming in fast from the north. They hadn't lingered, a quick, brutal piece of work. He was about to turn away, to leave the dead to the buzzards and the sun, when he heard it. A faint sound, barely a whisper of breath, from behind the overturned wagon. He drew his Colt, the click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the silence. He moved low and slow, rounding the splintered wheel. There, in the sliver of shade cast by the wagon bed, was a young woman. She was lying in the dirt, her light purple prairie dress torn at the shoulder and stained with dust and a dark splash of blood. She was no older than 18, with a round face flushed from heat and fever, her chestnut hair spilling from its pins. Her body was soft and full, a stark contrast to the hard, angular lines of the desert around her. He saw the shallow rise and fall of her chest. She was alive. A canteen lay empty beside her, and her lips were cracked and pale. They had left her. The outlaws, or perhaps even her own people, had simply ridden on and left her for dead. He knelt, holstering his pistol. Her eyes flickered open, hazy with pain and confusion. They were a deep, clear hazel, and for a moment they focused on him with a terror so profound it was almost silent. "Water," she rasped, the word dissolving into a dry cough. He unslung his own canteen and gently lifted her head, pouring a small, careful stream of water over her lips. He wasn't a man given to softness, but something about the absolute abandonment of her situation stirred a long, dormant piece of his soul. He tore a strip from a clean flour sack in the wreckage and, using the precious water from his canteen, began to clean a nasty gash on her forearm. She flinched but didn't cry out. He saw the grit in her. She was a survivor, left behind but not yet broken. He had come looking for what happened. What he found was a reason to stay. He got her back to his cabin as the sun began to dip below the western mesas, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and red. The journey had been slow, with her slumped against him on the mule, barely conscious. His cabin was a stark and simple place, built of thick pine logs chinked with mud. Inside it was clean and brutally functional. A stone hearth, a narrow cot, a rough-hewn table with one chair, and shelves holding tins of coffee, beans, and salted meat. It was the fortress of a man who expected nothing from the world and offered little in return. He laid her gently on his cot, the only soft surface in the entire structure. He worked with a quiet efficiency that came from years of tending his own wounds. He stitched the gash on her arm with a clean needle and thread, his large, calloused hands surprisingly steady. He cleaned her other scrapes and bruises and forced more water and a thin broth of jerky down her throat. Through it all, he said almost nothing. When she finally woke for good, the cabin was filled with the deep shadows of night, a single oil lamp casting a flickering golden glow. Fear seized her first. A strange man, a strange room, the memory of violence still fresh and sharp. She tried to sit up, a cry catching in her throat. He was sitting at the table, cleaning his pistol, the metallic scrape and click of the parts the only sound. He looked up, his pale eyes meeting hers in the dim light. "Easy now," he rumbled, his voice like stones grinding together. "You're safe here." Safety was a word she no longer understood. "Who are you? Where am I?" she asked, her own voice thin and reedy. "Doesn't matter who I am," he said, not unkindly. "You're 5 miles east of the Gila Pass. The wagon was hit." He didn't ask what happened. He stated it. She flinched, the memories flooding back. The shouting, the gunfire, the sight of her father's wagon master falling. "They took the horses," she whispered. "My family. They were ahead. They must not have known." He didn't reply, letting the silence hang. He knew it was more likely they did know and had chosen to run. Such was the nature of survival on the trail. "You rest," he said, standing up. "I'll take the chair." He gestured with the barrel of his gun toward the cot. It wasn't a suggestion. For the first time in her life, Clara was utterly alone, her fate in the hands of a nameless, silent man whose kindness felt as dangerous as the desert itself. The next morning she woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. The man was already up, moving about the cabin with the quiet economy of someone long accustomed to solitude. He had placed a plate with a piece of bacon and a hard biscuit on a crate beside the cot, along with a tin cup of steaming coffee. He ate his own, standing by the hearth, watching the horizon through the open doorway. Clara sat up, her body aching. The purple dress was ruined, but he had laid a clean, folded man's shirt at the foot of the bed. It was a gesture of simple, practical decency that struck her more than any words of comfort could have. She ate the food slowly, the first real sustenance she'd had in what felt like a lifetime. He did not press her with questions. He went about his morning chores, tending to the mule, cleaning his rifle, his movements deliberate and unhurried. She watched him, this stranger who had saved her. He was not a gentle man, but he was not cruel. There was a stillness about him, a deep-seated calm that seemed at odds with the Colt revolver tied low on his hip. She finally found her voice. "Thank you," she said. He grunted in response, not turning from his work. "For the food, for everything." He finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. "No need for thanks, just common sense to not leave a person to die." His gaze lingered for a moment on her bandaged arm. "How's the arm?" "It hurts," she admitted, "but it's better." An uneasy quiet settled between them. They were two strangers, bound by a moment of violence, unsure of what came next. She was a burden, she knew it. Another mouth to feed, a complication in his Spartan life. He was likely just waiting for her to be strong enough to send her on her way. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her. Where would she go? Her family thought she was dead, or had chosen to believe it. Just as the weight of her predicament threatened to crush her, the man stiffened. He was looking out the door again, his whole body alert. "Riders," he said, his voice low. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. The outlaws. They had come back to finish the job. But the man shook his head, his eyes narrowed. "No, a wagon, coming from the east." He squinted into the blinding sun. "Looks like they're heading straight for us." It was them, her family. The wagon was unmistakable, a large Conestoga that belonged to her father, Josiah. Relief washed over Clara so intensely it made her dizzy. They had come back for her. They had realized she was missing and turned around. She stumbled to the doorway, her hand shielding her eyes, a cry of joy on her lips. The man stood beside her, silent and watchful, his hand resting on the grip of his Colt. The wagon pulled up 20 yards from the cabin, and her father climbed down. He was a tall, stern man with a severe face and a beard trimmed to a sharp point. Her mother and older brother remained on the wagon seat, their faces grim. The reunion was not what she had imagined. Her father's eyes swept over her, taking in her disheveled state, the torn dress, the man's shirt she wore. There was no warmth in his gaze, only a cold assessment. "Clara," he said, his voice flat, "we thought you lost." "The outlaws," she began, tears welling in her eyes. "They attacked us right after you cleared the pass. I was hurt. This man, he found me." Josiah's gaze shifted to the stranger, sizing him up. He saw the gun, the weathered face, the hard set of his jaw. He saw a man who lived on the edge of the world. "We're in your debt, mister," Josiah said, though the words sounded more like a business transaction than an expression of gratitude. The stranger simply nodded, his silence more powerful than any speech. "We cannot linger," Josiah continued, getting to the point. "The trail is dangerous, and we've lost time. We came back as soon as it was safe." He paused, his eyes landing on Clara again, a flicker of something calculating in their depths. "However, our situation has changed. We are low on provisions. A long journey is still ahead." He looked from his daughter to the stranger. "You are a man alone. She is a heavy burden for a family on the move. She slows us down." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She could not believe what she was hearing. Her own father was speaking of her as if she were a sack of flour. "What are you saying?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Josiah ignored her, his full attention on the silent man beside her. "You saved her. By the laws of God and man, you have a claim. I will not see her fall into dishonor. I will give you my blessing to take her as your wife. We will consider your service a dowry. It is a practical solution for all." The words hung in the hot, still air, more brutal than any gunshot. Her family was not rescuing her. They were discarding her. The silence that followed was absolute. Clara stood frozen, the world tilting beneath her feet. Her father's words echoed in her mind, each one a hammer blow against her heart. A burden, a practical solution. She looked at her mother, pleading with her eyes, but her mother stared blankly ahead, refusing to meet her gaze. Her brother smirked, a cruel, triumphant little smile. She was nothing to them. Less than nothing. She was baggage to be jettisoned. The stranger had not moved a muscle. He was as still as the rock formations on the ridge, his face a mask. But Clara, standing so close to him, could feel the tension radiating from him, a low, dangerous hum. His hand had not left his pistol. He was looking at her father, and for the first time, Clara saw something truly dangerous in his pale eyes. It was a cold, quiet fury. Finally he spoke, his voice deceptively soft. "She ain't a piece of property to be traded." Josiah bristled, his piety a thin veneer over his callousness. "It is a respectable offer. Better than leaving her to fend for herself. She requires a husband, a protector. You are here. She is here. It is God's will." "Get off my land," the stranger said. It was not a request. The two men stared at each other. A silent battle of wills fought in the oppressive heat. Josiah was a man used to getting his way, a man who saw the world in terms of assets and liabilities. The stranger was something else entirely, something wild and unbreakable that did not conform to Josiah's neat, cruel logic. In the end, it was Josiah who broke. He saw no profit in a gunfight. He gave a curt, angry nod. "As you wish. The offer stands. She is your concern now." He turned without another word to Clara, climbed back onto the wagon, and cracked the whip over his oxen. The wagon creaked, groaned, and began to roll away, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled over Clara like a burial shroud. She watched it go, watched her entire life, her family, her past, disappear into the shimmering heat. She did not cry. The pain was too deep for tears. She was numb, hollowed out. The wagon vanished. She was alone, truly and completely, with the man who had been appointed her keeper. He stood beside her for a long time, the two of them watching the empty trail. Then he turned and went back into the cabin. A moment later he returned with a tin cup of water. He pressed it into her hands. Her fingers were cold and stiff. "You ain't a burden here," he said gruffly. And in that moment, hearing those 5 simple words from a nameless stranger, Clara finally broke. The tears came, hot and silent, for the girl she had been and the woman she would now have to become. Days bled into weeks. The arrangement her father had decreed was never spoken of again. It existed between them like a ghost, a contract signed in shame and dust. But their life fell into a rhythm that had nothing to do with marriage and everything to do with survival. He was a man of routines, and slowly she became a part of them. He taught her nothing of guns, but he showed her which plants were safe to eat and which would kill you, how to find water, how to read the sky for signs of a storm. She, in turn, brought a semblance of home to his stark cabin. She learned to cook on the open hearth, making meals that were more than just fuel. She mended his worn clothes with neat, careful stitches, and scrubbed the cabin until the pine logs gleamed. They spoke little, but a language grew between them in shared tasks and quiet glances. He would leave a brace of quail on the table in the morning. She would have it roasted for him by evening. She would find his water skins were low. He would return to find them filled from the spring she had discovered a mile down the canyon. She began to see the man behind the silence. She saw the way he treated his mule, with a gruff but undeniable affection. She saw the lines of old pain around his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. He was a man haunted by a past he refused to name. He, in turn, saw the woman emerge from the terrified girl. He saw her strength, a quiet, resilient force that had been buried under years of her family's scorn. He saw the intelligence in her eyes and the competence in her hands. He had rescued a victim, but he was slowly discovering a partner. One evening, as a storm gathered over the mountains, they sat inside, the cabin lit by the flickering fire. The wind howled outside, a lonely, mournful sound. "You never told me your name," she said softly, breaking a long silence. He looked up from the harness he was mending, his expression unreadable. "Don't have one I use." "Then I'll have to call you something," she said, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "I will call you Adam, because this feels like the first place." He didn't smile back, but the hardness in his eyes softened for just a moment. He did not object. The quiet before what came next was the longest silence of their lives. A few days later, while checking his snares high on the ridge, he saw tracks. 3 riders. They weren't passing through. They were scouting, moving in a wide, careful circle around his cabin. He recognized the specific V-shaped nick in one of the horseshoes. It was from a horse he'd seen lying dead at the wagon wreck. The outlaws were back. He didn't tell her at first. He didn't want to see the fear return to her eyes, not after she had worked so hard to banish it. But his actions betrayed him. He became more watchful, his silence deepening into a state of high alert. He spent an afternoon reinforcing the cabin door with an iron strap and boarding up half of the single window, leaving only a narrow slit to see and shoot through. He cleaned his Winchester and his Colt with a methodical, almost religious focus, the scent of gun oil filling the small space. Clara watched him, her heart growing heavy. She was not a fool. She knew this wasn't for hunting rabbits. "They're coming back, aren't they?" she asked one evening, her voice steady. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. He had underestimated her. He gave a single, sharp nod. "They think you saw them clear, or they think your father left something of value with you. Men like that don't like loose ends." Fear, cold and familiar, pricked at her skin. But it was different this time. It was not the helpless terror of a victim. It was the sharp fear of a person with something to lose. She looked around the small, sparse cabin. It wasn't much, but it was the only place she had ever been treated with respect. It was her home. "What do we do?" she asked. He looked at her, really looked at her, and made a decision. He wasn't just protecting a survivor anymore. He was defending his partner. "You're going to help," he said. He handed her not a gun, but an old powder horn and a bag of lead shot. "When the time comes, I'll need these loaded," he said, showing her how to measure the powder and seat the ball in his spare pistol, a heavy Colt Dragoon. "You keep this by the hearth, where it's dry, and you stay away from the door and the window." He placed 2 full buckets of water by the hearth. "If they try to burn us out, you use this. Understood?" She nodded, her hands closing around the heavy pistol. It felt cold and alien in her grasp, a tool of death. But it also felt like a choice. She was no longer waiting to be rescued or discarded. She was part of the defense. For the next 2 days, they waited. The summer heat felt heavy and suffocating, the air thick with unspoken tension. Every snap of a twig, every cry of a hawk sent a jolt through them. They were an island in a vast, hostile sea, and the tide was coming in. The attack came at dusk, the time of day the world turns gray and shadows play tricks on the eye. One moment there was the chirp of crickets, the next, the sharp crack of a rifle shot that sent splinters flying from the doorframe. Clara dropped the plate she was washing, her heart leaping into her throat. Adam, who had been sitting by the fire, was on his feet in a single fluid motion, his Winchester already in his hands. "Get down!" he barked, and she scrambled behind the heavy oak table she had tipped on its side. Another shot slammed into the cabin wall. They were surrounded. He moved to the narrow slit in the window, a phantom in the deepening gloom. He didn't fire wildly. He waited, his breathing slow and even. Clara could hear the outlaws shouting outside, their voices ugly and confident. "We know you're in there, girl. Send her out and we'll let the old man live." Adam didn't answer. He let them get closer, let their arrogance make them careless. A shadow darted between two boulders. The Winchester boomed, the sound filling the cabin, and a man outside screamed once, a sharp, ugly sound that was cut short. The shouting outside turned from taunts to angry curses. Gunfire erupted, a hailstorm of lead that thudded into the thick log walls. Splinters rained down, and the air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder. Adam moved from the window to the door, peering through a small crack. He was a man transformed, all his quiet stillness coiled into lethal purpose. Clara, huddled behind the table, felt a strange calm settle over her. She focused on her task. She reloaded the spare pistol with trembling but steady hands, her movements precise, just as he had shown her. She was a part of this fight. A flicker of orange light caught her eye. They had thrown a torch onto the dry thatch of the lean-to where he kept his firewood. Flames began to lick up the side of the cabin. "Fire!" she yelled. Without hesitation, she grabbed one of the water buckets and, staying low, scrambled to the wall where the fire was taking hold, dousing the flames through the chinks in the logs. The wood hissed and steamed. He gave her a quick, approving nod before turning his attention back to the fight. A bullet tore through the wall near his head, and he grunted, stumbling back. "Are you hit?" she cried. "Just a graze," he growled, but she saw the dark stain spreading on his sleeve. He was bleeding. He fired again, and another shout echoed in the night. There were fewer of them now. The fight raged on, an eternity compressed into minutes. Finally, a desperate silence fell. The quiet that descended was heavier than the gunfire had been. It was a listening silence, filled with the ringing in their ears and the ragged sound of their own breathing. Adam stood motionless, his rifle still aimed at the door, waiting. Minutes stretched on. The only sound was the drip of water from the wall where Clara had put out the fire. "They're gone," she whispered. "Maybe," he breathed, not relaxing his stance. "Or waiting." He waited for the first hint of dawn, the pale gray light that separates true darkness from day. Only then did he slowly, carefully, unbar the door. He stepped outside, his Colt now in his hand. Clara followed, her eyes wide. 3 men lay dead in the dirt. A 4th had left a thick trail of blood leading away into the brush. He wouldn't get far. The leader, a big man with a cruel face, lay near the woodpile. He hadn't been shot. In the dim light, Clara could see the 2 small puncture marks on his hand and the dark, ugly swelling that ran up his arm. A large rattlesnake, disturbed from its slumber by the commotion, was coiled defensively a few feet away, its rattle a dry, menacing whisper in the sudden dawn quiet. The desert had claimed him. They stood there for a long moment, surveying the carnage. The rising sun cast long shadows, turning the scene into a tableau of brutal survival. The threat was over. It was finally, truly over. Adam swayed on his feet, and Clara rushed to his side, seeing now how pale he was under his tan. The graze on his arm was deeper than he'd let on. "Sit down," she ordered, her voice firm. For once he did as he was told, slumping onto the cabin step with a weary sigh. She fetched the clean rags and the bottle of whiskey he used for cleaning wounds. Just as he had done for her what felt like a lifetime ago, she carefully cleaned and bandaged his arm, her touch gentle but sure. Their roles had reversed. When she was done, he looked up at her. The sun was just clearing the mountains, and in its clean, new light, he saw her not as the abandoned girl in the purple dress, but as the woman who had fought by his side, who had saved his home, who had bound his wounds. His expression, usually so guarded, was open and vulnerable. "You can stay," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "if you've a mind to." Clara looked at him, at his tired, weathered face, and then at the cabin that had become her sanctuary. She looked at the vast, unforgiving landscape that she was no longer afraid of. "I've a mind to," she said softly. It was not a marriage contract, but a partnership, forged in blood and sealed in the quiet light of a new day. The seasons turned. The brutal heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden days of autumn. The land around the cabin changed, the greens fading to brown and yellow, and so too did the life within it. The bullet holes in the walls were plugged with fresh mud, the memory of the attack fading like a bad dream. The quiet between Adam and Clara was no longer one of wary strangers, but of comfortable companionship. They worked together, falling into a seamless rhythm. He would hunt, and she would preserve the meat for the coming winter. She cultivated a small, hardy garden in a patch of earth protected by the canyon walls, and he built a low stone wall around it to keep out the deer. The cabin, once a simple shelter, began to feel like a home. She placed jars of wildflowers on the windowsill and wove a colorful rag rug for the cold floor. He built her a sturdy rocking chair to put by the fire, his hands, which she had only ever seen hold a gun or a tool, proving to be surprisingly deft. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he pulled a small, tarnished silver locket from his saddlebags. He opened it. Inside was a faded picture of a young woman with his same pale eyes. "My wife," he said, his voice thick, "and our son, lost to the fever back in Tennessee, before the war." It was the first time he had ever spoken of his past. He told her his given name then, a common name for a life that had been anything but. She listened, her heart aching for the grief he had carried alone for so long. She reached out and placed her hand over his. He did not pull away. The sham marriage, born of cruelty and convenience, had slowly, quietly, transformed into something true. It was a bond not of passion, but of deep, abiding respect. It was the trust of two survivors who had found in each other a reason to build again. The light purple dress, mended and clean, was folded away in a wooden chest. It was a relic of a life that no longer belonged to her. She now wore buckskin and sturdy denim, clothes that fit the woman she had become. One afternoon they stood outside, watching the sunset, a spectacle of impossible color that set the western sky ablaze. He put his arm around her shoulders, a gesture of simple, profound affection. They had been thrown together by violence and abandonment, but what they had built in this wild, lonely place was a peace more real than anything either had ever known. Stories like this from the frontier remind us that families are not always the ones you are born into, but the ones you forge in the fires of survival. They show that strength isn't about the gun you carry, but about the resolve to stand up after you've been knocked down, and to build a home in the most unlikely of places. If this story of two outcasts finding their way in a harsh world resonated with you, please give this video a like. Share it with someone who appreciates tales of the Old West. And for more stories of grit, survival, and the human spirit, be sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What to you was the most powerful moment in their journey from strangers to partners?